Erin that they were a big inspiration to me to pursue data science, and Erin didn't know this. So just to say something about that, coming from the San Francisco Bay Area, obviously from the beginning of my life, I was surrounded by a lot of engineers, tech was all around me. I just sort of thought that was the norm. I wasn't encouraged to pursue tech. Then I kind of became punk rock in my teen years, which led me to be some kind of Luddite, and I was like anti-technology. Then later in grad school, and this is the context in which I first met Erin, I started learning about some cool ways in which tech was being used to support often communities in struggle, to use tech for cool artistic purposes, and I got quite excited. And so actually this idea of getting technical knowledge into the hands of people that haven't traditionally had access to it is very much at the heart of CodeOp. And the reason for that is because we want more folks like Erin doing the work that Erin's been doing. So just to share a few fun facts about what that work entails. Erin is currently a postdoctoral researcher at the New York University's Interdisciplinary AI Now Institute. For those of you that aren't familiar with this institute, the AI Now Institute studies the social implications of artificial intelligence. And Erin, correct me if I'm wrong, you're researching the digital platforms used by landlords in order to survey and racialize tenants. Erin also co-founded the Anti-Eviction Mapping Project, which is a data visualization, critical cartography, and multimedia collective documenting dispossession and resistant struggles upon gentrifying landscapes. Erin earned a doctoral degree in Feminist Studies from the University of California, Santa Cruz, with a focus on the politics of space, race, and technology in Romania and Silicon Valley. And Erin is also an editor at Radical Housing Journal, working to help build international housing justice solidarities. Erin, it's a total honor to have you here. Thanks for joining us. So the way it's going to work, folks, is I'm going to mute myself now and let Erin take the stage, who has a presentation they want to share with you. And after this, we can open it up to ask questions. Yeah.
Sounds good. Thanks so much for the introduction, Katrina, and thank you all for being here and yeah, being open to listening to more about the projects that I've been a part of and the work that I've been engaged in. And I'm excited that it's also informal and that we can all engage in dialogue afterwards and think together. A lot of what I'm going to share is really a work in progress, so it would be great to hear people's thoughts and think together about some of the issues. Yeah, and it's just also lovely to be here because I never would have imagined when Katrina and I met, yeah, I think it was 2011 or so, that almost a decade later we'd be here doing this different work that we're doing, and it's really cool to see how it's kind of still very interconnected. So thank you. So I'm going to just do the awkward thing of turning my screen share on for 1 second, so bear with me. Okay. Oops. Sorry. Okay, there we go. You can see this? Yeah, great. Okay, wonderful. So again, my name's Erin. I am currently a postdoc at the AI Now Institute. And as Katrina mentioned, I'm also co-founder of the Anti-Eviction Mapping Project, which is a data visualization and digital cartography, and also multimedia collective that documents gentrification struggles and also resistance to gentrification, but also uses technology to provide tools for resistance. So I'm going to start by really kind of just explaining more about the mapping project, and I'm going to give you kind of a history of the project and show how we've been essentially grappling with these paradoxes of techno-capitalism and gentrification, but also ways to use technology in order to fight back, which I suppose will be a theme throughout the presentation. So I'm going to start kind of chronologically sharing some of the work that we've done and a lot of the thinking I've had around these paradoxes, and kind of walk folks into the present, where we're producing new work to respond to housing inequities engendered by the pandemic. So you'll get essentially a chronology here. And towards the end, I'll explain a little bit more about my current research that is looking at AI and different platforms used by the real estate industry in order to abet cycles of gentrification. And I guess just also, before I get too deep into anything, I just want to say that a lot of what I'm going to be sharing, pretty much everything that I'm going to be sharing, is part of a collective effort. So I don't want to give the illusion that anything I'm sharing is just mine. And really, it's everything has been the love and labor of so many different people. And that's been a really important thing for me in terms of the work that I do, that it be collective and that it be shared and that it be done with and not for or about different people most impacted by gentrification. And yeah, so I just want to state that. And I wouldn't have time to list everybody who's been part of this, but I'm happy to talk more about that at the end too. But without further ado, this is our website. So also most of what I'm going to be showing you from the Anti-Eviction Mapping Project, you can find on our website, anti-evictionmap.com. So if anything I share is something you want to kind of dive more deeply into later, likely you can find it there. So yeah, so the Anti-Eviction Mapping Project began in 2013, really during the height of what a lot of people at the time were calling the tech boom 2.0, or the second .com boom, but essentially this moment in which we were seeing tech companies attract a lot of venture capital and create, there was a proliferation of startups. Also, a lot of people were moving to San Francisco and Oakland and other cities to work in Silicon Valley companies, often enabled by what we were calling, Google bus stops or Facebook bus stops, but essentially the private luxury transportation systems that Silicon Valley companies like Google, Apple, Facebook, et cetera, were using in order to attract new workers to the Bay Area. So the idea was that, you could move to San Francisco and live in what you can see here on the left was this real estate, a new kind of real estate geography that this realtor, Jennifer Rosedale, nominated the Quad. So basically she took what was the Mission, which is a historically Latinx neighborhood in San Francisco, and rebranded it the Quad and started advertising, if you move here, you can, live in this tech-like area and take the Google bus to work and kind of be in this tech campus, like, I don't know, situation, which was supposed to attract people to move to neighborhoods like the Mission, which has been one of the many ground zeros of gentrification. And what we were, witnessing was a surge of rental increases, but also evictions. And in particular, we, as a mapping project later found, about 70% of evictions during this time period were happening close to these tech bus stops, because realtors knew that they could raise rents and charge more for tech employees who were making more on average than the people who had been living in the neighborhood for generations. We were also seeing areas like West Oakland, as you can see on the right, get rebranded as this like new edge of Silicon Valley. In the middle, you can see right now, there's been an ongoing struggle in San Jose also to prevent a new Google campus from being developed. And that's been in the works for many years now. And communities there understand that this too is going to raise rents and incite racial dispossession. So this was sort of the context in which we emerged. And I had already been doing housing organizing really since, I guess, Occupy with the foreclosure crisis. And I'd actually already been doing, I had started doing housing organizing in Romania before this. So I had been thinking about evictions, but it was around this period that I just started witnessing my own friends and community members getting eviction notices and being forced out of the city as rents were going up and evictions were going up. But we, in not wanting to be Luddites and in wanting to think about ways we could actually use technology to fight back, we coalesced as the Anti-Eviction Mapping Project, we being at the time just a few housing organizers. I had actually never made a map before. We just had this idea, like, let's just make a map of where the evictions are happening. And maybe this can help on the ground housing justice efforts. And one of the things that we were starting to notice just in our organizing work was that so many people were getting evicted by LLCs and LPs, which are very common in the US context, but limited liability companies and limited partnerships, which are essentially shell companies that corporations often use in forming businesses. And what I didn't know at the time, and I've come to learn since then, is that around 2008 with the foreclosure crisis, which of course also decimated housing landscapes across the US, but also globally, I know, especially in Spain, with companies like Blackstone coming in and buying up all this property. At any rate, what we started seeing in 2008 was big investment companies using dozens and dozens of shell companies to purchase properties. And this offers them different liability protection. But interestingly, what it also means is that often tenants don't actually know who their landlords are. So just as an example, I have this friend, Benito. He, in 2013, got an eviction notice from, well, he had a landlord who was an aging landlord. He had had the same landlord for like, I think he said 30 or 40 years. The landlord sold the building to Pineapple Boy LLC. And so all of a sudden, Benito was told he had to start paying his rent checks to Pineapple Boy LLC. And Benito didn't know who this was. He knew the address of Pineapple Boy LLC, but that was about it. And within 3 months of Pineapple Boy LLC buying the property, Benito got an eviction notice. And so he came to us wanting to organize and fight this eviction, but didn't know how to do so because he didn't know who Pineapple Boy LLC was. And often if you're doing anti-eviction organizing, it really helps to know who the landlord is, right? So so the Anti-Eviction Mapping Project, when we formed, we made this map on the left, which is on our website. But basically how it works is you can use a mouse and hover over the map and see where evictions took place. But also if we were able to figure out who the landlord was, we would list who the landlord was. And the idea for this was basically to embolden tenants in their organizing, and also to help people just like figure out who their landlords were. So we found out that Pineapple Boy LLC was actually the shell company for this investor named Michael Harrison, who happened to work for Vanguard Properties, which was this big real estate company in the Mission. And so with that information, we were able to organize a series of demonstrations at Vanguard Real Estate. And after the fourth demonstration, they had enough and they withdrew the eviction. And Benito was then able to work with the Community Land Trust and get basically a 99-year lease for him and his other co-tenants. So kind of through this research oriented activism, or maybe activism with research, we were able to stop an eviction. And yeah, so we also made these stencils, as you can see here on the right, and started giving them out. And people were using this map to mark sidewalks outside of buildings where they could find evictions, basically to make it less attractive to real estate speculators and people who might move into buildings after evictions took place. And so these were just some really early efforts we had in wanting to better highlight where evictions were taking place and who the evictors were. We were able to figure out who many of the evictors were for one particular type of eviction in San Francisco. They're in the US, and particularly in San Francisco and different California cities, there are multiple types of evictions. And I would probably spend way too long if I tried to get into it, but basically they're divided into fault and no fault evictions. So fault evictions take place if you break your lease, which could be doing something really benign, like playing music too loud. You know, you could get an eviction notice for hanging laundry on a clothesline if it says in your lease you shouldn't do that. But there are also no fault evictions, which means you haven't done anything wrong and you're still evicted. And there are different types of no fault evictions. The Ellis Act is one of those. It's a California state law that was passed by really the real estate industry in the mid 1980s in order to make rent control protections weaker. And rent control, for those who don't know, basically protects tenants from evictions and keeps people's rents from going up more than about 2% each year. And a lot of different cities gained rent control in the late 1970s and early 1980s. And after that, the real estate industry was trying to find a way to weaken rent control and basically bypass these tenant protections. And that's what the Ellis Act is. And so anyway, when we started as a project, we were trying to get eviction data from the city's rent board that could tell us who the evictors were. The only data, we were able to get eviction data for all types of evictions, but the only type of eviction in which they would give us any information about the evictor was the Ellis Act. So Benito's eviction was an Ellis Act eviction. I actually found that Ellis Act evictions in particular were being used in this era. And so we really focused on Ellis Act evictions at first because that was a data source that we had access to. But as I'll show you throughout this presentation, we've been working hard over the years of figuring out who the evictors are for all types of evictions and creating different tools and resources to help tenants figure out connections between properties. And I'll get to that, but this is our first work. We also started basically just through a lot of manual research, creating maps like this, which are of course not geospatial, but in this case, we were trying to figure out all of the different players behind this one investment company called Urban Green Investments, which moved on into San Francisco around the same time period, 2013. And with cash, they bought up dozens of buildings, each through different LLCs. So they had 55 Dolores Street LLC and 49 Guerrero Street LLC, 1070 Post Street LLC. And with each of these LLCs, they would buy up a building, evict the tenants, and then the goal was to flip the building and sell each unit as a condo to people who could pay more money. And so we created this map to better understand just who, where all the properties were, of course, but also all the different players behind them. So we were able to trace back, well, we were able to figure out the CEO of Urban Green was this guy, David McCloskey, whose father, Tom McCloskey, owned a big company in Colorado. And that he had all these connections to both the Republican and the Democratic parties, and also was a big influencer in the Aspen Institute, which is a far-right think tank in Colorado. And so with this information, we were also able to figure out all the different buildings that were currently being evicted by these different shell companies and work with the tenants in each building to basically create a multi-building campaign against Urban Green Investments. And we were, trying to get different friends and comrades we had in Colorado to also pressure this Colorado company. And this is, I think, still kind of a dream of ours and a lot of other housing organizers, but basically creating these multi-building campaigns and targeting different targets where pressure can be effective. So if we can suddenly have a demonstration in Colorado and one outside a number of locations in California at the same time, in order to stop an eviction, it can be successful. And we were successful in stopping one eviction at 55 Dolores Street this way, where they were trying to evict, at the time, a 97-year-old woman, Mary Elizabeth Phillips, who I think because she was so old and because we had all of this power and we were engaging in these multi-building campaigns in Urban Green Investments, we were able to pressure Urban Green into ceasing her eviction and letting her live out the course of her life in this building, which she was able to do. And then she passed away at the age of 100. And since then, Urban Green came in and flipped the buildings. And now the 6 units in her building are all housed by tech employees. So that's sort of, what happens. And now there's a Whole Foods right across the street. It kind of perfectly highlights the way that gentrification unfolds. But at least we were able with this research to help her stay housed for a few years. We also started creating profile pages on particular evictors like this, where we would just kind of list out their different LLCs and the different buildings they owned and the different evictions that they had been a part of. Again, primarily based on the Ellis Act eviction data that we had available to us through these record requests. And yeah, this guy, Sergio Iantorno, he was evicting a number of buildings at the same time. And we did actually I'm saying more than the mapping project, but different housing groups in San Francisco together were able to stop a handful of those evictions and convince Sergio Iantorno that he should instead sell those buildings to the Community Land Trust, which, as in the case of Benito, bought the buildings and then offered these tenants lifetime leases. So for us, that's like one of the ultimate kind of goals, taking this property off the market and enabling tenants to stay housed throughout their lifetimes. So about a year into our kind of, being the Anti-Eviction Mapping Project, we realized that while we were working with a lot of kind of quantitative data sets to help produce information to stop displacement, we were still creating very reductive maps that were really simplifying complex stories into dots, strategically and essentially, but we realized we didn't want to erase the complexity of those stories. So in 2014, we launched what we call now our oral history or narrative wing of the Anti-Eviction Mapping Project, which we call the narratives of displacement and resistance. And so this is our oral history map, where we produced oral histories with different tenants who had been evicted or were in the midst of fighting eviction or experiencing gentrification in various ways. And I have Frederick's photo highlighted here, and maybe Katrina remembers too, but Frederick was actually one of our cohort members when we were in grad school together, who did end up facing displacement afterwards, but is luckily now housed. So yeah, a lot of these stories were produced with different people we already knew and had connections with in the Bay Area through our various networks. And often they're about an hour long and offer kind of these deep kind of histories of different neighborhoods and different people's experiences of displacement, and also their own analytics. We don't want to impose our own on them, and different people have different ways of theorizing what's going on, and we really wanted to create space for that complexity in this map. So yeah, we also realized that we were producing a lot of online content, and not, of course, everybody likes or has access to online platforms. And so we began, for instance, producing murals. This is a mural we made in Clarion Alley, which is a sort of famous mural in San Francisco for its political murals. It's a famous, yeah, there are many different murals there having to do with different aspects of social and racial justice. And so this mural that we made is basically a close-up of our oral history map, and we have different portraits of different tenants whose stories are featured in the oral history map. And here we also included the story of Alex Nieto, painted and narrated by his parents on the left. And Alex was unfortunately murdered by the police in San Francisco in 2014, after 4 newcomers to the Bernal Heights Mission neighborhoods racially profiled him and called the cops, who then murdered him. And we really wanted to call attention to this being a more lethal impact of gentrification. Yeah, and so we've since occasionally added new stories to this mural as the oral history project continues. And unfortunately, since Alex's death, many more people have been murdered by the police in San Francisco, some of whom were homeless. And this is an ongoing issue and struggle, often very linked to gentrification. We also, though, on a more positive note, produced our first zine in 2015, which we gave out when we released our mural, which is mostly a sort of homage to all the victory stories of people who were still housed and who had been successful in fighting back through direct action. And so we wanted to create space for that too, and not only tell these horror stories, and in hope that some of the victory stories can inspire other people to fight back. We began around this time to work with different community clinics who represent tenants in court who face eviction, because we acknowledged that a lot of the data we were getting from the rent board and through our record requests was, we don't generally get any information about tenants who are being evicted or anything about them. And so to understand the demography of displacement and who's being evicted, we would have to work with different clinics or conduct our own surveys. And so the Eviction Defense Collaborative, who we started working with, represents about 90% of tenants whose eviction cases go to court in San Francisco. Of course, a lot of people are informally evicted and many people's cases don't go to court. But of those whose do go to court, the Eviction Defense Collaborative has a pretty good sampling since they represent about 90%. And so working with them, we were able to figure out that Black tenants were overrepresented by 300% in 2016 in terms of who was being evicted, and Latinx tenants were highly overrepresented too. And of course, this isn't, we already knew that evictions were highly racialized and that it was predominantly whiter and wealthier people moving into San Francisco, and disproportionately Black and Latinx tenants being displaced. But this data was very telling and very stark, and I think important to conduct research around, as it can help kind of push for anti-racist approaches to conceptualizing gentrification. So yeah, so we've continued to work with them and a bunch of other housing organizations since then. And we had wanted to produce work in Oakland right around the time that we started, because members of our own collective were living and working in Oakland, but we had a really hard time accessing any eviction data for Oakland. And the longer that I've been doing this work, the more I've come to find each city and each county and each state is so different in the US in terms of what data they make available. And San Francisco is actually very good in terms of making eviction data available through the rent board, whereas Oakland has a rent board, but we had to petition it for 2 years to get any data from it. We were finally able to get data, and since then we've been petitioning it to get data again, to update our data sets, and have been unsuccessful. So it really goes to show just how variegated the data landscape is in terms of eviction data. California has what's called a masking law, which is actually a good law that protects tenants from having their data exploited by tenant screening companies, which will often use eviction histories to basically create a blacklist, as they call it, of tenants who have been evicted in the past or have had court cases to make it harder for them to rent in the future. California does have a law that was intended to keep tenants' data masked from these tenant screening companies, but it also means that as a collective trying to figure out who evictors are, we also don't have access to that data statewide or from any county court. So the best source we often have in California is from various rent boards, and rent boards only exist in cities that have rent control. And there are only a couple dozen cities in the whole state that have some form of renter protection. Until there was a statewide law that was passed about a year ago that offers kind of pseudo rent control to different cities statewide, but that's not the same as an actual rent control. And doesn't mean that all cities have rent boards. But at any rate, I'm just saying this to kind of talk about how different city landscapes are in California alone in terms of data and eviction data in particular. And even though Oakland has a rent board, it has much less funding than San Francisco's, which means that there are just less resources they have in terms of making it available, and less impetus to kind of create access. But at any rate, we were finally able to get eviction data from Oakland and created this interactive report with Tenants Together, which is a statewide housing group in California in 2016. And we also started doing a lot of video work, which you can see here, and embedded videos into the report, which is this online interactive report. We also created our first, what we call community power map, which we've continued to make since then, which essentially is a map that, instead of mapping evictions, maps specifically community assets and different sites of power. with the idea being that, so often Oakland in particular gets written about and mapped through a very like pathologic, very racist lens, which is only oriented towards looking at loss or violence or, very racist ways of coding the city. And so we wanted to intentionally create a map that showed sites of power, since there are so many, and also Oakland has such a rich and inspiring history of community organizing. And yeah, from the time of the Black Panthers to today, it's so rich. And so we really wanted to highlight that in this report. Yeah, we recently even created a 30-minute film called Tenants Rise Up, which you can find on our website, which includes the story of Auntie Frances, she's a former Black Panther in Oakland who was evicted, got an eviction notice a couple years ago, and with community support fought back. And this video is kind of an homage to her and her organizing struggles, but also entwines the story of different tenants in San Jose fighting the Google campus, and then tenants in Santa Rosa organizing for rent control. So it's a recent film we made as an homage to different tenant organizing in the Bay Area, and kind of as we tried to do in this Counterpoints project, this film really emphasizes the need for a regional approach and not just a San Francisco-based approach to understanding what's happening in the Bay Area in terms of gentrification and Silicon Valley, which is our own sort of, I think highlights our own learning curve, because when we began, we were definitely very San Francisco focused, but what we're seeing is, cities all over the Bay Area are being impacted in very different ways, and also sometimes similar ways. But as we've grown as a project, we've tried to become more nuanced and attentive to the differences through our different community partnerships regionally. Yeah, and so let's see, after making our first zine in 2015, we made our second zine, which we published last year, which is called Dislocation Black Exodus. And it's actually a 150-page zine, so it's essentially a book. You can find it on our website, but it's the story of Black displacement in San Francisco from the period of redlining to urban redevelopment and renewal of the 60s and 70s and 80s to today. And I myself wasn't involved in this particular project, but I recommend it to anybody interested in learning more about these deeper histories of anti-Black racism in San Francisco, which often get erased in the sort of more contemporary stories of gentrification today, which are very focused on the tech industry. And so we did this too to kind of intervene in our own sort of tendency to be so focused on the tech industry and the present, and to think about these other technologies of displacement and dispossession that predate the present, but that definitely lay the groundwork for it. And then in 2017, we started a new chapter in New York City and in Los Angeles. This is some work from our New York City chapter, which kind of building off what we did in San Francisco, we created the worst evictors in New York City list and a map of all of the evictions in New York City. And some of this was used through in a collaboration with the Right to Counsel Coalition and Just Fix NYC, which are two groups we partner with in New York. And with them, we held a mock tribunal against the worst evictors in New York. And you can see here different tenants who got together. And for us, even though it was a mock tribunal, it was a way to build tenant power and connect tenants to each other who might be facing similar forms of abuse and harassment or eviction from the same landlords. And then in Los Angeles, we've been doing all sorts of work. I myself haven't been involved in any of this Los Angeles work, but there's been a lot of narrative work in particular that they've been doing to better tell the story of gentrification, but also resistance. And this photo documentary project on the right was a way to work on better humanizing folks who live on Skid Row in LA who have borne the brunt of all forms of racist and classist and sexist violence enacted upon them as LA gentrifies. So for the last, I guess, 3 years, it feels like decades, we've been working on our first print book, which will come out later in December or early January with PM Press, which is an Oakland-based press. And it was the first time we actually tried to turn what were like online digital maps into print-based maps. I think often it goes the other way. You'll see a lot of people trying to turn print-based maps into digital maps. But for us, because we started as a digital project, we were faced with this sort of weird challenge of condensing, what could be like a time-lapse interactive map with different data, depending on where you click on it on a map, to something flat. And so it was this project. That's partly why it's taken 3 years. It also has over 200 images and maps, some of which are our own, but we also had a call for contributions from community partners. So we have photographs and poems and stories and maps produced by different collaborators outside of our collective. So this was our call for images and ideas, but just to kind of give you a sense, a lot of the maps entail this sort of work where we'll have something online and time lapse. Like this is our map of killings by police officers in San Francisco that will then condense to something, I guess, easier to understand without having to click on it, as you can see on the right. And these are the different chapters in our atlas, which I think also kind of show our own thinking and our own orientation to thinking deeper histories of gentrification and racial dispossession that predate the contemporary moment, and that also sort of emphasize this need for a regional approach. And so we have a chapter on evictions and root shock, one on indigenous geographies of resistance, one on health and environmental racism, one on gentrification and state violence, one on infrastructure, transportation, and economy, one on migrations and relocations, and then the last one on speculation and speculative futures. And in that one, we're trying to think about, financial speculation and all of these LLCs and LPs, but also ways that people and communities are speculating on other futures, maybe antithetical to those of the real estate industry or techno-capitalism. So I'm walking us into some of the more present work. There was, for those who weren't following it, this really beautiful and inspiring organizing effort that started about a year ago by several mothers in Oakland, now known as Moms for Housing. But they essentially were unhoused Black women in Oakland who recognized that there were plenty of houses in Oakland to house everybody without homes. There was this one building on Magnolia Street in Oakland that had been vacant for years, and it had been purchased by an investment company called Wedgwood, which has purchased hundreds of properties throughout California in the aftermath of the foreclosure crisis, which of course disproportionately targeted Black homeowners. And so big investment companies like Wedgwood, but also Blackstone, which probably folks in Spain are again familiar with, and Invitation Homes purchased all of these properties that had been foreclosed upon with their different LLCs. And in Oakland, a lot of these homes are still sitting vacant. They're basically waiting for gentrifiers to move in and occupy and pay these big single family rental companies rent. But these mothers recognized this one home that had been foreclosed upon, had been vacant for years, and reclaimed it through an occupation. And after a lot of community organizing, with hundreds and hundreds of people in the neighborhood, they were successfully able to actually reclaim the property legally with the Oakland Community Land Trust. But they've of course faced a lot of repression before this. I mean, some were arrested. The Wedgwood tried to force them out and tried to, do all sorts of things to keep them from reclaiming this property. But for us, the mapping project wasn't involved in this particular reclamation, but it really was inspiring to us and kind of showed us, again, the utility of making this sort of information more accessible so that other people can think about reclaiming other vacant properties. And yeah, what would it mean for all the tenants in Wedgwood buildings, for instance, to work together and network together to fight this big investment company. And so that has really inspired this tool that we've been building. We've been building it for, I guess, since the spring of 2019. So we started building it before the Moms for Housing struggle, but I think the Moms for Housing struggle really helped us feel as though this project had merit and could be useful. But we're calling it a Victor book. It's currently private and password protected, but it's a project where it's a lookup tool essentially, where you can look up an address or an LLC or a landlord and figure out all of the different buildings owned by that corporate network, and if any evictions have taken place in any of them, and basically the entire building history. We've been building it out with our community partners in San Francisco, and we're currently working on an Oakland version right now with other community partners in Oakland. This is essentially what it looks like. So this is our current version, and we now have some amazing UI and UX designers on board. So now it's looking better, and hopefully it's more user friendly. But again, you look up a landlord, an address, or even a neighborhood, and you can find out anything that we know about it. Essentially what we're doing is merging a few different data sets in this project. So we've got the eviction data, as much as we have of it at any rate. We're merging that with parcel ownership data, which tells us who owns what parcel at any given time. So we're doing what we're considering like spatial and also temporal joins with the parcel ownership information and property transfer information. And then we're merging that with Secretary of State corporate entity data. So all of the business data, like all of the LLC and LP data that gets registered with the state. And we're connecting all of this through a graph database using Neo4j, which I had never heard of before, but basically it enables us to make connections between different data points according to nodes and edges. So instead of just kind of creating a more linear relational database in order to connect this data, we're able to almost connect it as if it's like a spider web or something like that. And we really wanted to use that graph database because the corporate data in particular is so web-like and recursive, where you can have an LLC that owns an LLC that owns an LLC. And so for us, that was a big learning curve in this project, but one that I think is really exciting and enabling us to produce better data in order to abet on the ground efforts. So that's one of our big projects. We've also, in the wake of COVID, been mapping eviction moratoriums and housing justice actions that are happening globally. This was our first global map ever. Since the pandemic is so global and is impacting tenants everywhere. But we have wanted to do this really intentionally with community partners outside of the US. And so we've been building relationships with the European Action Coalition for the Right to Housing, which unites different housing groups throughout Europe. Also, we've had a lot of comrades in Brazil who are part of this project. And then we've had folks organizing rent strikes in Rome, outside of like formal organizations get really involved. And then, yeah, the Radical Housing Journal, which I'm a part of, which does work globally, and the Housing Justice and Unequal Cities Network, which is looking at housing justice globally. So it's been a really exciting and kind of daunting project. It's also the first project where we've built in internationalization features so that it can detect language and display information in whatever language somebody's browser is set to if we've done the translation work. And we're now trying to find a way to visualize evictions that are happening as different eviction moratoriums expire. We also are doing oral history work with people who are fighting back and are working on a sound visualizer in order to display that. So there's that. And then kind of the other thing is that this is more connected to some of my postdoc research, but in the wake of COVID, there have been a whole slew of companies that are considered prop tech companies. We're calling them landlord tech companies, but essentially technology companies used by landlords and property managers. And what we've been seeing is a lot of these companies try to find ways to exploit the pandemic or capitalize upon the pandemic and convince landlords and property managers that they need new technologies in order to manage their tenants. So we're seeing, tenant screening companies like this one called Neighborly on the right advertise that it's building out basically landlord credit bureaus so that landlords can report on tenants who can't pay rent due to the pandemic, and that this data what they're saying is that this data will be used to basically keep those tenants from securing housing in the future by putting them in this blacklist. There are companies like Civil on the bottom that are basically, they're like a TaskRabbit company that is basically offering employment, precarious labor to people who help in eviction processes, like help hand out eviction notices. But there's all sorts of things. And there are a bunch of companies that are trying to find ways to make money right now. And that's partly because the whole housing system has been flipped on its head with the pandemic. So up to a third of renters in the US have been unable to pay rent, disproportionately Black and Latinx renters. But rents are going down in cities like New York and San Francisco. Commercial venues are considered less desirable or less stable for real estate investors. And so what we're just seeing is all sorts of new solutions be kind of peddled by different prop tech companies, which was already a growing industry pre-pandemic, and actually is an industry that that became really big after 2008, when again all of this property ownership structures shifted with the foreclosure crisis. And what we saw in 2008 was a bunch of prop tech companies emerged claiming that they could help landlords manage these huge swaths of properties that they now owned, with companies like Blackstone owning thousands of properties. They needed new technological solutions in order to kind of administer and manage these properties. So we saw the rise of online rental payment platforms, automated eviction notice services, but also kind of galvanizing upon the AI boom. Companies like this, Stonelock, claim that landlords could basically force tenants to give up their keys in exchange for subjecting their faces to facial recognition technology. And so there have been a lot of buildings where tenants now have to basically subject their faces to these face scans in order to enter their buildings. And companies like this, Ari Tiemann, this Tiemann company has this product called GateGuard, and they've advertised to landlords, if you put in this facial recognition system, it can help you detect if your tenant is breaking the lease, and then you can use that data in order to evict them in the future. And what's really scary is that we know that facial recognition systems are extremely biased due to the labeling systems that their algorithms use. So disproportionately, these systems have been modeled on white male faces. And we know that they're extremely biased against women of color, and particularly Black women. And in buildings like Atlantic Plaza Towers, which is this 718 unit building in New York, where my friend Trinae Moran, who you can see on the right, lives. It's a building where most of the renters are Black, and where the landlord decided to install one of these facial recognition heat mapping systems, again, in the name of safety. And Stonelock is the company that makes this, and Stonelock has incidentally been peddling its wares right now in COVID, saying it can help landlords detect, it can help landlords keep their buildings safe by keeping tenants from having to touch doorknobs. So it often will use this language of safety and protection. But as Trinae and others living in the building said, safety hasn't been one of their concerns. They know that this technology is racist, and they suspect that the landlord just wants to install it in order to gentrify the building and attract wealthier and whiter residents. So this kind of gets to the end of my presentation, but one of the things that I've been up to lately is this Landlord Tech Watch platform, which is a public education site around what this technology does and how it works. We've been trying to create a nomenclature that categorizes all of this technology according to harm, so that tenants can better understand how technologies like facial recognition or tenant screening are impacting them. And we've been crowdsourcing information about deployment and looking at how it's changed in the wake of COVID. And we've been holding monthly strategy sessions with different tenants who are experiencing this, so that they can work together in finding ways to fight back and organize direct actions or think about policy changes. So I can get way more into that if folks want, but I know I'm just throwing a lot of information at you all. But that's really, I think, where I'm going to end in terms of the work that we've been up to in the mapping project and some of what I've been up to over the last year as a postdoc, looking at these prop tech systems and their impact on gentrification, and particularly in the wake of COVID, how they're targeting and racializing tenants. Yeah, I'm gonna leave it there and open it up for questions, and hopefully I can help clarify anything I said, since I know I was throwing a lot of different types of information your way. So, thank you.
I have a question. I'm Courtney. I live in Austin. And so what we're seeing now is a lot of gentrification from moving Black and brown people outside of the main hub in Austin. And the way that they're trying to justify that is by, in the new high rises that they're building, they're going to offer like maybe 10% of the units to be quote unquote rent controlled, but they're usually the smallest units with no outside lighting or anything like that. And I would just like to know your thoughts on that. Like, just where, like, if you have any thoughts on those special units that are supposed to be for low income people, and if there's a way that, I don't know, like, it makes me just want to fight back for some reason, because it's just, they're usually unfair. So I just would love to know your thoughts around that.
Yeah, absolutely. Let's see. So often what we're seeing is when new luxury or market rate developers petition to build new construction, they'll be, they'll soften it by saying that they'll build like 10 to 20% affordable housing units. I can't speak to the situation in Austin, but what we've seen in San Francisco and the Bay Area more broadly is that often it's very bizarre, because I mean, if you're in a city that's losing affordable housing, you would need way more than 10 to 20% of new development built in order to even maintain the status quo of who's able to live in a city. So, if somebody's building 80 or 90% new luxury or market rate development, they're not helping the problem at all. They're really just exacerbating it. And there have also been stories of the affordable units that get built being built in quote unquote like less desirable areas, which is of course often a racist way of talking about geography. But what we'll see is like there might be some, I don't know, like again, like cool hip neighborhood, and the luxury and market rate development will be built there. And then there might be an area where people are facing intense environmental racism, and the affordable housing units will get built there, or might get built with like substandard plumbing, or things like that. So in San Francisco, there has been this growing movement that often calls itself YIMBY, Yes in My Backyard movement, that has basically claimed that the only way to solve gentrification is through development, because we need more housing. But really the problem that housing organizers always kind of highlight in response is like, sure, we could always use more affordable and below market rate housing. But what we need to do first and foremost is stop evictions. And then if new development is built, like we need it to be 100% affordable, because otherwise we're not doing anything to keep people in San Francisco or in whatever city we're talking about within it. So that's kind of my response, but happy to talk more.
Thank you, that was very helpful.
Great.
Okay, I'll go ahead and jump in. Thank you so much for sharing your experience. So I'm just starting out in the tech industry. I'm still learning about it. I haven't been employed. And this is something that I'm very concerned about, is creating harm through my new field of work. So I wondered if you had any advice for people who are just starting out in tech, either what to do or what to look out for, so we're not perpetuating all these problems that you discussed.
Great. No, I appreciate that question. I mean, I think people ask me this sometimes. I think often what I say is that, you know, the tech industry has really thrived through this sort of like let's just break everything and then, you know, fix some things and just experiment with all sorts of new projects and new designs and you know, develop this and develop that. And we've seen, you know, people come in thinking that with an app or something they can help stop displacement, or I mean, and essentially we're in the mapping project also building an app to help stop displacement. But I think really none of that will ever work unless the folks building the technology are deeply immersed in the struggles that they're talking about and working on. And so, I mean, often I just say it's really great to, depending on what your interest is and what you want to be involved in, but to really just like immerse yourself in whatever that struggle is, and learn about it that way, and then work with the folks who are kind of on the front lines and who have been for a long time in figuring out the solution. Because I think, especially in San Francisco, it's just there, you know, I mean, even in terms of mapping software, right? Like there are always new mapping softwares that are being developed that are supposed to do this and that. And then we'll see like community groups like be like, oh, okay, we'll use this to help build something. And then the company will lose funding and disappear. And then the communities are like left with a broken map. So I think, yeah, I think the importance of going slowly, even in contexts of that might be kind of extreme and seem like we need solutions immediately, but I think at least starting slowly in terms of immersing yourself in the struggle, and also just really making sure that whatever you're building or developing is sustainable and has infrastructure that can kind of outlive or outlast your own involvement in it. Those are just like some of the things that come to mind. But just to, but I think we definitely need folks with tech skills in these struggles, and yeah, I'm not saying this to dissuade anybody from getting involved. Like it's like super important, and it's been such a privilege and luxury to be able to work with different developers and designers in the mapping project. And yeah, so I don't want to pretend that that's not important. It really is.
Just to riff off of that, Erin, thanks so much for doing what felt like a deep dive into the work of the mapping project. Very, very powerful stuff. Thank you for co-founding something like this. But yeah, this question of how are you working with developers and UXers in the project? And even more deeply, how is the mapping project structured?
Totally, yeah, I didn't get into that that much. Yeah, so when we began, really, it was just a few people with very little mapping or development skills. And I think over time, we've different folks who have either been in the industry and then left, or who are interested in working on development and, you know, UX and UI design. but who don't want to necessarily just be in these sort of corporate settings will get involved. We also have more people than not come from, like, I guess, oral history and narrative backgrounds and housing organizing backgrounds. So it's an interesting mix because everybody's bringing different skills and different experiences. I think that for the most part, like, it's been a really generative space. And I think we've really tried to emphasize that everybody has skills that others can learn from. And we've been really, I guess, trying as hard as we can to not overprivilege tech skills and underprivilege, for instance, like narrative skills or storytelling skills, which, you know, the world often does, especially in terms of funding. So even when we do like grant writing, which we do sometimes, we're often really, even though our software expenses, our storage expenses are way more expensive than our narrative expenses, we mostly are applying for arts grants and grants to sort of bring funding into the narrative work, since that is an especially underfunded area. But we ourselves are not a nonprofit, we're not for profit. We have no paid staff, everybody's a volunteer, but we do grant writing to fund particular projects as best we can. And, you know, we didn't emerge imagining that we were going to have 3 chapters. And I think probably, I would say like maybe 15 to 20 volunteers in each chapter. And a lot of people coming in and out, since it is volunteer based. So we didn't design the mapping project with that in mind. And so it's been kind of put together in a very ad hoc way. And so we're doing a lot right now, especially over the last year, we've been doing a lot to kind of build in more sustainable infrastructure ourselves as a project, in terms of like some of the admin labor, in terms of funding stuff, all the sort of less glamorous work. Because I think often people come into the project just excited to work on storytelling, or excited to make a mural, or excited to develop a piece of software, but not necessarily excited to write grants or figure out those sorts of logistics. So we're spending a lot of time right now working on that. And also we've got a crew of folks who are working on trying to build out free and open source templates for us to use in the different projects that we make, so that we can be less reliant on different corporate platforms, which is of course way easier said than done. So that's an ongoing thing that we're working on. But we have monthly all chapter meetings where people in all 3 of the chapters get together for about 3 hours. And in those, we talk a lot about infrastructure and admin stuff, but we also do a lot of political education work. So we have an entire political education team that basically puts together programming just for us so that we can learn and think together. And that's really, really new. We hadn't been doing that until recently. And we hadn't been thinking about like infrastructure so much until recently. So that's what we're doing now, especially because in COVID times, everybody's online. So folks from all 3 chapters can meet regularly. But pre-COVID, we would have generally monthly meetings in each chapter in person, and often maybe weekly meetings for particular projects. So like the Evictor Book Project meets, we'll have a weekly meeting, but then also we'll have maybe other like interspersed meetings for the data pipeline, or for the front end development, or for UI and UX design. But it's, each project is different. Some projects are way more like developer heavy, like the Evictor Book Project and the COVID Mapping Project, and some are way more narrative heavy, but we're trying our best to really merge those 2 wings as best we can, which I think also just helps us kind of keep ourselves in check in terms of not creating, I don't know, too much of a sort of tech culture within our own organization, and make sure that, I mean, we are creating technology, but that we can sort of avoid some of the hierarchies that are very common in larger tech companies. So,
Thank you.
Yeah.
I have a question. I am a technical writer for a company that develops a data orchestration tool, and I'm wondering how you work with your data, basically.
Probably. I'd love to learn more about what you're working on. How do we work with our data? So again, it really depends on the project and who's working on it. And we've got a couple people who swear by R and we're doing, are using R for everything. We've got other folks who are using other, languages. So I would say Python and R are probably the most common languages that we share in terms of analyzing data. In terms of storing data, with the Evictor Book project, like we're still using AWS, even though we don't want to be. And so part of our efforts right now are oriented towards finding alternatives for that. Yeah, and then in terms of making the connections between the data sets, we're using, I think I mentioned Neo4j, which is that graph database project, and a language called Cypher, which helps us query that data. But I don't know if that's what you were asking.
Yeah, that's exactly what I was asking. Yeah, I was just curious how you are all putting it all together, and that's really interesting. And I don't know that there's anything I could do to contribute, but we could definitely chat about what my company does privately if you'd like to.
Absolutely, yeah, thank you. I definitely would be very curious about that.
Can I ask a question similar to that? I think you've touched on this a little bit, but in terms of data privacy, working with these communities, so when you're working with these outside companies or something, what does that look like to make sure that that data is protected and may not be used for harm way?
Yeah, no, that's a really important question. That's something we're always thinking about and trying to get better at. So when it comes to eviction data, like we're not actually getting, when we make our record requests for eviction data, we're not getting any data about the tenants themselves. Like we don't get tenant names or any identifying information. And I mean, we don't even get evictor information that unless it's the LS Act data set. But all the ways that we can identify evictors are through merging these different data sets. And that we're less worried about making private because we think that should be a public right to know like who an evictor is. But some of the sensitive data that we do have is the narrative data. So the oral history data is of course quite sensitive, and we work with tenants through what we call a double consent process. So when we conduct an oral history, we'll first sort of explain the risks of having somebody's story go public with the tenant, and they'll sign a document. And then before we make it public on our website or on a mural or whatever the format might be, we'll have them sign another form saying that they understand that, again, there could be risks involved. Particularly, we once had the lawyer of a landlord use somebody's oral history against them in a court case. And when the tenant found out, they wrote to us right away and we took it down. But we, I mean, that's sort of the last thing we want and is antithetical to the whole point of collecting stories and making them public. So I think we're always trying to figure out how to be more, I guess, just conscious and to make sure tenants understand the risks involved in having their story go public. But in terms of storing the stories themselves, we're in the middle of trying to find a better platform to house them and to archive them in a way in which we can, with whatever system we archive them, we can still go back in and edit them or take them down should a tenant ask us to take them down. And yeah, we didn't have a really good method of doing that before. Like we were using like SoundCloud to host the stories and keeping them on, backups on people's individual machines and hard drives. And yeah, so we're trying to come up with a better system for that would also have some sort of archival capacity. And there's a platform called Aviary that we're thinking of using now, and we're talking with them and trying to figure out if that might work. But yeah, also happy to, if that's not quite what you're asking, I'm happy to
Oh, no. That was definitely it. Because I was thinking about for Moms for Housing, I know that we're getting into the era where people are using data like the AI stuff to use it against them, especially in retaliation of like the Black Lives Matters protest. So I was just I just wanted to know like how y'all were storing or keeping that data safe. And yeah, just that's what I wanted to know. But thank you.
Oh, no, totally. I mean, we definitely have had a lot of conversations also with different housing organizers and also tenant lawyers about the evictor book tool, or about the profile pages we make on landlords. Mostly just wanting to make sure that none of that could somehow get used or scraped by a tenant screening company and used. But it doesn't sound like it can be, and it sounds like most tenant screening companies already have access to the data we have anyway.
Okay.
That's what we've learned so far. But yeah, that's been for us maybe the biggest question that we've been just trying to make sure we're doing the right thing around.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah.
I'm not sure if Courtney is trying to talk, but you're on mute.
Oh, no, I wasn't talking. I'm sorry.
I have a question, I suppose. It's more about your kind of personal path in tech, but what kind of, you said that you have, you just received or finished your PhD in women's studies, right? So what has your kind of tech side path been, and how have you learned the skills you've learned?
Totally. That's a good question. So yeah, I'm not formally trained in any sort of development work at all. I, before doing my PhD, had actually before even the master's where I met Katrina, I had mostly an arts background. So I did learn some design and just like website development stuff pretty informally kind of through doing that. And yeah, I mean, I think, I suppose my own sort of orientation has been more like on the hacky side of things in terms of trying to learn how some of this stuff works. But mostly like what I'm doing at this point in the mapping project is research, and then the community liaisoning and the kind of workshops and interviews with tenants and tenant organizers in terms of UI stuff and making sure that what we're building is relevant. So I'm definitely not the one doing all the cipher querying for a Victor book right now, or the front end development, or but it's sort of I would say more like research and design oriented position, but really I'm always approaching it first and foremost as a housing organizer. And yeah, my dissertation had nothing to do with this stuff and was much more about housing organizing histories in Romania, which is the whole other thing that I can talk about. I mostly kept out of this presentation to not be too all over the place. Yeah.
Cool, thank you.
Since you brought up Romania, Erin, I'm kind of curious, and I don't know if this has come up in your more recent project that you said has been a collaboration with friends from around the world. And in addition to that, having this educational space within your monthly meetings. In what ways have the situations in other communities around the world been different, presumably quite different than what's happening in San Francisco, for example? So has there been anything that's surprised you? Can you shed a little light into some of the differences?
Yeah, totally. I mean, I'm always learning about other places through my involvement with the Radical Housing Journal, which I'm an editor of, which is global. And yeah, there's this network housed at UCLA called the Housing Justice and Unequal Cities Network, led by Ananya Roy, who's an amazing urban studies, urban planning scholar, amongst other things, who's been very focused on global South analytics in terms of understanding housing justice and unevenness, I suppose. But yeah, so my own kind of background in housing organizing, I think, really starts though through different, I suppose, like stories and anecdotes that I first came across when I was in Romania in like 2011 or so, 2010, where I was learning about how disproportionately it's Roma communities being evicted in post-socialist contexts in Romania, mostly in Cluj and Bucharest. And yeah, I was, what I've come to learn through that work, and this was a big focus of my dissertation too, is about the histories of property restitution in post-socialist contexts, particularly in Romania, but this has happened in other like formerly socialist spaces in Eastern and Central Europe. But essentially housing, I mean, it's a long history, but housing was nationalized, a lot of housing was nationalized in the early like 1950s when state socialism began in different countries, which meant that private property was essentially made public. And a lot of people who had no housing prior were given housing by the state. So a lot of Roma communities didn't have housing or permanent housing before due to long histories of racism in Romania going back to slavery and failed reparations there. So what we saw was that, you know, a lot of Roma folks moved into different newly public housing in the beginning of state socialism. And, you know, you fast forward to 1989, state socialism ends. And of course, there were many problems with it. I'm not trying to glorify the project of state socialism, but when it came to housing, there was actually a lot more housing equity, because since then what's happened is properties that were nationalized and made public are being restituted back to the descendants of pre-socialist owners. So basically the heirs of the pre-socialist bourgeoisie. And in that process, disproportionately Roma communities are being evicted. And so there's a huge problem with highly racialized evictions in Romania right now because of that history, which is a history that I think is often erased through kind of pro-capitalist or pro-liberal democracy lenses, or very, very anti-socialist lenses. And I think often people just like read about or think about some of the, I guess, yeah, more negative, you know, impacts of an increasingly authoritarian socialist regime in the 80s, but don't think about housing equity or racial justice in housing. So anyway, that's a lot of what I was looking at for the work that I was doing in Romania, which was done in collaboration with a group called the Common Front for Housing Rights in Bucharest, and a group called Social Housing Now in Cluj. So yeah, I recommend, like, both of those groups are really active and doing a lot of important work right now, and are part of a nationwide coalition called the Bloc for Housing Rights. And I've just learned a lot from all of the organizers involved, and they've really been my biggest teachers in sort of understanding this.
Cool, thanks.
Yeah. Sorry, I haven't had a chance to look at all the comments now, and I'm now seeing them, but thanks for all of them, and thanks for sharing my email address too.
So how does another chapter emerge? And do you see maybe there's already similar work happening in other places? I mean, presumably there is, no? So I know that you have a chapter in Los Angeles, New York, San Francisco. You're collaborating with folks right now following the pandemic. Do you see Anti-Eviction Mapping Project, the tools that you're using, the methodologies? I mean, you have a structure that you said was, well, being built ad hocly, but it's had this organic process. And it sounds like, I mean, just based on the work that you've produced, to be some kind of system anyway, a method to the madness that produces really rich work. You know, if there are communities and other places around the world and they want to follow in that spirit and those methods, is there something for folks?
Yeah, no, absolutely. Yeah, it has been for us extremely organic. We never anticipated the chapters in LA and New York, but those really formed after members of our Bay Area project either moved, maybe they were from those two cities and moved back, or moved to them for the first time and brought some of the sort of methodologies and analytics, and I think in particular the kind of slow building of community partnership kind of ethos that we developed in the Bay Area to those chapters. So each chapter, before just like making maps and tools, spent about a year just developing community relations and trying to figure out what was already going on. And it was really different in each city. Like there were a bunch of different groups in New York that had already been building really important tools. So that group was really careful not to kind of reproduce those efforts, but think about where they could plug in and support. Yeah, there's a group called the Mapping Action Collective in Portland that is relatively new, but they formed after having met a bunch of us and wanted to form like a somewhat similar project. So they're sort of like our unofficial sibling, but we work together on a lot of projects. Like we have, there are about 4 or 5 folks from their collective that work with us on our projects, and then some of us work with them on their projects. Yeah, and then we often get, I mean, there's some folks in North Carolina and Durham right now who we're meeting with, who are interested in maybe developing a similar landlord lookup tool. But yeah, so there might be some code sharing or something like that that might happen with them. But yeah, for us, it's been important that any of the chapters that form, or any of these sort of sibling projects, are rooted in housing justice organizing. And like we don't want to just kind of go into somewhere new and be like, we're gonna be the sort of like saviors, or something like that. So so I think it's really happened organically, kind of through these connections we built, and yeah, just I don't know, just existing and traveling and meeting people. And like the folks in Portland, I think they first invited us up to do some talks, and then we met them in some other conferences, and just it all started kind of happening organically like that. So I think we're always very open. There's a group in Montreal that started a project that they called the Anti-Eviction Mapping Project without telling us, so which is totally fine. So there's some Montreal group that has the same name as us, but we haven't been working together, but maybe we will. It was, yeah, so I think it's very contextual, I suppose.
Okay, so I have one final question, but before I do that, I'm just going to have a long pause. So if anyone's been meaning to ask a question, please do. Okay, so my last question, Erin, if folks want to support the work that you're doing with the mapping project, how can we do that?
That's a good question. Well, yeah, I mean, anybody is welcome to contact me if they're interested in joining. We do have a bunch of folks who are living in different countries right now who are working on projects, especially because we're all virtual and all meeting virtually. So there are some folks in the Evictor Book Project in Poland and China and Korea. So yeah, there are ways to get involved in working with us if that's something you're interested in doing. But yeah, otherwise, I mean, we're always, I think just getting the word out in case if you know of anybody who might want to get involved. Yeah, we do take donations to help, pay for our infrastructure. Or, a lot of our community partners also take donations to help them do the sort of base building frontline work that they're doing. So all of those things are always helpful.
Cool. All right, everyone. Wow, really excellent hour and a half. Thank you so much. We've learned so much. It's been really inspiring. I'm so glad that we've had this time with you, Erin. And thanks everyone for joining us to learn. Erin's email is in the chat. And if you have any questions, feel free to email me as well. Whatever, we're around. But have a good evening, everyone. Thanks for being there.
Thanks so much for having me. I really appreciated having the opportunity and getting to meet you all. So thank you.
Absolutely.
Good night, everybody.
Good night.
Contacto de los compañeros que son números están